All right.
Very good. Okay, well, hi everybody. Thanks for joining the session on two-factor authentication with CAS, a tale of two factors. And hopefully there are some Charles Dickens fans here that get the reference. So, what are we going to talk about specifically? Do a little bit of introduction. Hopefully some of that stuff is duplicate to you. Most everybody knows me, and I know most everybody in the room, so we'll be quick. We'll talk a little bit about the objectives of two-factor authentication with CAS, what it is and what it means, and possibly the extension that we did, Unicon did on CAS to start supporting multi-factor and two-factor authentication, really, although it can be extended to multi-factor, which we'll talk at length about. Next, architectural details, a decision that we had to make on top of the CAS code base to support those objectives. Will be fairly technical presentation. I intend to kind of walk through some of the important components that were put together, because chances are that if you're going to take this code base and run with it, you're likely going to be modifying them. So I try to touch upon some important areas in the code base. And then we'll talk a little about what we're going to do next. The development on the project that I'm going to review here is still ongoing. We're not done. And we'll talk about what we plan to do next and how we're going to achieve those. And then there will be hopefully some questions or nothing at the end. And then we can just all rest comfortably. I don't have a demo for you, but I will have some really cool screenshots. If you do need to see a demo, come see me afterwards. And I have a URL that you can give you to try. Everybody good? Excellent. So that's everything I pretty much told you about. We're going to focus on extensions that allow CAS server, the Apereo CAS server, to enable multi-factor authentication. We'll focus on requirements, technical design decisions, and possibility to further contribute all this to the actual CAS community and code base, and what our roadmap is going to be coming forth. I'm Misa Mohit, ignore the GH. At the end, I am part of the CAS project and a Unicon employee. I collaborate with Bill Thompson, John, and Jim on all stuff identity access management related, and part of the open source support program at Unicon for CAS, especially among other things. And if you ever need to reach me, this is where I live. Again, I mentioned I work for Unicon. Unicon provides domain expertise, support and services, and custom projects on and around enterprise open source software, primarily for higher education. I specifically, being a member of the IAM group, deal with CAS, SHIP, Grouper, Open Registry, and all other stuff. I am related again. And of course, Unicon provides open source support, commercial support for all these products and more. If you have any questions, please do come see any of us, and we'll be happy to help you. Very good. So let's ease into the interesting bits of the discussion. What is MFA? So effectively, this is the simplest explanation I could come up with, where MFA is additional steps to authenticate and verify the identity of users. So there is a primary way that you can authenticate folks, typically, let's say, by username and password. And then there will be additional factors or steps that you would implement to figure out to effectively strengthen the identity or the level of trust that you place in the way that somebody is authenticated and you know their identity. And these factors could be something that you know as the user, or something that you might have on you, like a particular device that generates PIN codes, or it might be something that you are, like your blood sample or your, I don't know, eye scan or DNA, something like that. There might be some conspiracy in terms of things that you are and things you have. Am I my blood, or do I have my blood? But we'll just leave that for now. So once you kind of bone up on the basic concept of MFA, you need to effectively decide three things. You need to decide on strategies that you would like to indicate this required secondary nature of authentication method. You'll need to figure out how to communicate that that step has been fulfilled, so that applications that are going to use MFA and require it understand the context that has been fulfilled. And you'll need to also provide ways so that applications can not only validate that authenticated assertion, but there would need to be a level or some sort of a relationship between these authenticated methods or levels or the context that has been fulfilled and the ranking between them. Some are higher than others, some are lower than others. And so we need to come up with a relationship of how we're going to rank and strategize these authenticated contexts. So, and then on top of that, what the heck is CAS MFA then? CAS MFA is effectively a CAS extension that is built on top of the CAS 352 code base. The project was collaborated between Unicon and Evergreen State University. If you listened on the most recent IAM webinar, there was a presentation about this particular subject at a high level. And so it's just an extension on top of the CAS code base. What it does is it allows support for multi-factor authentication as is the primary objective. And again, it allows relying parties, or in other words, applications, to understand the authenticated context. Did I log in with my blood sample? Did I log in with my username, password? What did I use? So that the application can understand that context. And then obviously these applications can also indicate what their required level of authentication is. Do they need strong two-factor? Do they need something else? So there is the ability with this extension to indicate those requirements to the CAS server. That's what CAS MFA is all about. Let's get started. Everything that I'm going to be reviewing and demonstrating to you is hosted on this particular GitHub repository under the Unicon space. It's just like anything else the Unicon does in the wild, for the most part. It's free and open to the public, and you can certainly go there and take a look at all the code activity and documentation and everything. And I will be referencing a lot of components, important components, out of this particular repo. So please bookmark it if you ever need to. Okay, let's talk a little bit about first steps and what decisions have been made in this particular code base to allow MFA. So I mentioned that there needs to be a strategy to specify the authenticated method, or the required authenticated level needs to be told to the CAS server, so it can then alter the authentication flow for the user. CAS MFA, this particular extension, augments the CAS protocol by allowing an additional parameter to the login endpoint. So you specify that my required authentication method, as the relying party that you are, is strong two-factor, or whatever else that you would have otherwise configured the CAS server to know about. This particular authentication method is understood by the CAS server using a particular component that in the CAS code base is called an argument extractor. Effectively, it takes a look at that extra argument and it extracts it from that URL. This argument extractor in this snapshot that I'm showing you is configured to support a list of supported authentication methods. And although at the login URL I'm specifying I need strong two-factor, you can have many, 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 many more in this list to support other types of two-factor authentication. And so this is what happens when you actually specify this. Then the CAS login flow recognizes that, hey, you are put into an authentication flow that requires strong two-factor. And after you're successfully authenticated, you'll be proceeding to the second step. And this is an authentication method that the CAS server recognizes. In other words, this strong two-factor was put into the configuration, and CAS understood that it can actually walk you through that flow. If you do, however, start to put something like string, as I'm trying to do over there, it will tell you that, sorry, I don't know what you're trying to do, and I don't know what you're talking about, and you probably need to talk to an administrator, or if you're a developer, do something. Now, my point is, there is support for recognized and unrecognized authentication methods. So it's smart enough to know what it's being requested for. So once you authenticated, then we need to sort of augment the flow, right? We need to ask and understand what that second factor, what that second step is, and then authenticate the user. So how do we do that? CAS by default uses Spring Web Flow to orchestrate the login flow. Every login, the entire sequence of the login flow, as you've already deployed CAS, possibly in Node, is controlled and directed by Spring Webflow. So, and Spring Webflow has this concept of subflows. You've got one giant flow that basically directs the login flow, and inside a flow, you can branch out to smaller flows and come back to the primary one. Right? So think of a highway. You exit from here, and then you enter the highway again. It's exactly like that. So we're taking advantage of these subflows, these small branching within the primary flow to take care of that additional second factor authentication and then come back to the main flow to do what CAS usually does by default, which is generating the right ticket and establishing SSO and all that other good stuff. So what's going to happen? These authentication methods that are specified as subflows, the primary authentication handler, that is username, password, that is radius, that is whatever it is that you have configured, will execute. And then it will recognize that I need to branch out and go to this particular subflow that deals with strong 2-factor, strong 3-factor, or whatever it is the authentication method that is requested. These subflows can be chained, meaning a subflow can branch off to another subflow, and then to another subflow, and then to another subflow. And what this allows us to do is that by chaining these, we can truly achieve multi-factor authentication. So this is what happens when strong 2-factor authentication method is requested, and the primary authentication method has happened. We launch into this particular subflow, and it tells me that, hey, admin, I know who you are. Let's go ahead and do second factor authentication for you. And it knows what second factor authentication is for strong 2-factor. That's the authenticated method that was provided. So, as is tradition in Apereo, you can never go out, you can never finish a conference session without showing some XML. So here we are. This is a quick snippet of the CAS login flow. I'm just showing you some really interesting stuff, important stuff, where there is a real submit, which is where primary authentication happens. You authenticate, and then you tell the flow that I want to go to MFA strong 2-factor. If you determine that I need to go there, branch off to this particular subflow, and there is the subflow definition that describes what you need to do in terms of completing that branching and spinning off to the second factor. So how are these subflows then organized in the code base and extension? So we came up with the simplest possible configuration we could think of, and I'm sure this can be still improved, but every subflow, every branching, every authentication factor effectively comes with 2 files. There is a file that describes the machinery and the mechanics of that factor by the servlet.xml file, and there is a file that describes what the flow should do when you branch off to that particular authentication factor. And these files are recognized by their flow ID. So if you have strong 2-factor, you'll have 2 files for that one. If you have duo, you'll have 2 files for that one. And then you just kind of take that model and run with it. So what does this all mean, really? As I mentioned, you can achieve MFA by chaining these subflows. Right? You've got this primary flow, and every branch you can still branch off of a branch, and you keep doing this until you can truly satisfy what's being requested of you. So if you're asked for a Hulk level strong MFA, your flow that you can chain it all together might be that first I'm going to do my primary authentication with LDAP, then I'll do it with a PIN. I've got a hardware device that generates that token for me. And then I'll authenticate with my DNA, and then many, many more until I'm done and I know that I can truly just stop. Again, a disclaimer that there is no blood sample authentication handler in CAS. You have to write that yourself. But it's important that the requested authentication method only affects, or you can only configure it, at least with this extension and in this context, what happens after the primary factor or the primary method executes, right? So you need to decide, how are we going to authenticate everybody? We're going to talk to LDAP, we're going to talk to Active Directory, we're going to talk to a web service, and then we're done. And then if I need to additionally go into a second step and carry out extra step, then I can come to this extension, for instance, and figure out what I need to do for that extra step. So, what does this all still mean, again, is that by default and in the CAS architecture, once you authenticate, CAS does not care. It does not care where you come from. It does not care what the source, where your user accounts are located. As long as there is a particular component, a handler, that knows how to talk to the source, then upper layers that establish SSO and all the other fun stuff, they're happy. And so when we started to think about MFA, we realized that we want to be able to follow that same model. In other words, every authentication handler that you have already used in CAS to authenticate folks against LDAP or databases or anything, all those components can be still used to become second factor authentication handlers, right? And so you don't have to come, we didn't come up with new APIs, we didn't come up with a redesign of how the authentication process or engine is gonna execute. We said there is a process that CAS is agnostic to the way you authenticate, and if you're gonna do MFA, you should be able to do the same thing. The API should not change for you. So for those of you that have worked with authentication handlers or have written your own, you can simply just take one and put it in CAS MFA, and that's the way you would authenticate users in second factor or more. So in this particular screenshot, for the strong two-factor configuration, I am simply using that as the second factor in my strong two-factor way of authenticating people. I'm going to accept a set of users right here, and those users are CAS user and Melon. Right, so I authenticate with whatever I do primarily, and then I launch off here, and I'll do my authentication with CAS user and Melon. And this could be swapped to be any authentication handler CAS supports, or the one that you write. So at this point, we are good, and we have managed to sort of indicate to the CAS server what the required authentication method should be. And if you have successfully gotten to this point, and if you've sort of been following along, this is the point that I'll stop, and this is the point that CAS server has established its SSO session. And it's done. It's completed the MFA context, and then the request is handed off to the application. Any questions so far? Yeah.
2 questions. Would it be difficult to configure it to only do the, like if you have a two-factor token, to not do the primary authentication?
Just do the two-factor.
Yeah.
Just do the payment hardware. No, not at all. Okay. What you do is you configure CAS to accept that form of authentication, and you don't specify the extra authenticator method. Oh, this is a good question. If you don't specify a required authentication method, CAS will behave just as it did before. So this is not a required change that applications would have to make. You can, if your CAS is configured already to do, token-based authentication, you can simply just do that without worrying about it.
We have normal LDAP authentication now.
Yeah.
There's some sites that would like to use the token, but I haven't asked them, but I'm sure they don't want to have to type in their LDAP password and then type in the token.
Right. Right.
They want like one or the other.
Okay. You can do that, but not within the context of MFA. We can talk about that later. But effectively, you need to come up with per service way of authenticating, or per application way of authenticating. Makes sense?
Yeah. Second question is, if you've already authenticated, have a single sign-on session with your just normal password, primary password, then someone wants two-factor.
Yep. What happens?
Yeah.
All right, hold that question. I'll get to it. That's a good question. Thank you, David. And we're actually easing into that topic, which is the part where we need to validate that authentication content. We've satisfied something, but what if somebody else comes in and says, I want a different thing? What happens? We'll talk about that. So, after remembering and validation. So, how do we remember what we just did? Right? We satisfied strong two-factor, or we satisfied duo, or something else. How do we remember? How does CAS server remember? So these steps that are remembered, that authentication context, is remembered by another component in CAS that is called a metadata populator. And so the authenticated method that is fulfilled by the CAS server goes into the authentication object. Effectively, it becomes a part of your SSO session. It's the ticket granting ticket. It's a property of your TGT, and it just remains there. So for those of you that are Java programmers or understand this, this is how the code actually gets it, that it knows what the authenticated method is, and it attempts to put it into the authentication object up here. So that's how the metadata is remembered. So once the CAS server remembers, and this is important, that we're only remembering one thing here, right? We're not remembering many things. If you satisfy strong two-factor, then that's the only thing CAS remembers. And if you came again, and we'll talk about this more, but since you asked the question, if you came in again, I want strong three-factor, then that will effectively overwrite what CAS remembers. So we're just remembering one thing here. There's no hierarchy yet. So once we remember that, we got to be able to tell the applications that we did this, right? They need to be able to know what the satisfied context was with CAS. So the CAS protocol is augmented a little bit, and there is now an extra tag here with authn_ method that will automatically be populated with whatever the authenticated context was. In this case, I perhaps authenticated with my Google account, then that was a requested authentication. Could have been strong two-factor, strong whatever. So the protocol is also changed to support relying party. So how do we validate? Again, to David's question. We are remembering, just to emphasize a bit more, these authenticated methods that are exact single tokens, right? It's just a string. It means nothing to anybody else other than CAS and the relying party. With the current extension and the ones we're reviewing together, there is no way yet to rank, combine, or substitute these authentication methods, right? So if by ranking I mean that you might have authentication methods that some are more secure, some are less secure than others, right? Maybe you just want username and password, maybe you want that plus something else. Sometimes there are situations where you can't satisfy that particular authentication method, but you can substitute something else that is equivalent to it, right? So there are many use cases around this, but just to keep things simple, we decided that we're going to remember one thing, and there is no way to rank because it's just one thing, right? So we try to keep things simple for first draft of the code base. So what happens really when CAS has if there is no SSO session with CAS, if we don't know who you are effectively, we're just going to follow through the flow: primary handler, secondary handler, and the third, and it just goes on. We move then to the MFA subflow. We branch off from the primary subflow, and we only do that if what is being asked of us is different than what we already remember, right? Because we're remembering one thing again, right? So if we are already authenticated and our context is strong two-factor, and somebody else comes in with another request, a different app comes in and says, I want strong three-factor, we'll say, all right, we can't satisfy it. We're not ranking. We don't know if you're higher or lower than us, and we can't substitute. There's nothing like that. So what we're going to do is we're simply just going to forget what happened, and we're going to move off to whatever the strong three-factor might indicate to us. And that's how the flow will proceed if there is a mismatch. So I tried to crudely put together a very ugly diagram to describe what really happens. An authentication method comes in. A request comes to CAS. Do we have SSO or not? We don't have SSO. Let's keep things simple. We'll do primary authentication. We'll branch off, satisfy that particular authentication method. We'll remember it, and then we just move on to the app and let the app handle it. If we do have SSO, can we satisfy that authentication method? Do the strings match? If I'm given strong two-factor, does the thing that I remember, is it still strong two-factor? If it is, well, then great. I don't need to do anything. I'm already at that level. Just move on to the app. But if I do, figure out what branch I need to go to, execute that, remember it again, and then move on. Make sense to everybody? It's a simple diagram, but we have to think about this, twice hard to figure out how to keep things really, really simple. There's a lot of ways you can get this very complicated, and I'll talk about those ways as well. So, and that's the time to talk about those things. So going forward, what do we plan to do next? So Unicon is collaborating with University of Utah, actually, Brian representing, to enhance this particular extension to allow additional use cases. Right? This stuff is really good. It works. We've deployed it for Evergreen State University. Very happy with it. All collaboration, all public, as I mentioned. But there is still room for improvement and enhancement in many ways. So what we want to do is, I mentioned that these required authentication methods or levels are sort of opt-in. Right? As an application, you can request that my authentication method should be strong two-factor, right? That particular parameter gets submitted to CAS and it gets processed. What we want to do is we want to be able to specify a required authentication method per service, per application in the service registry. So the application doesn't have to specify, they don't have to opt in. As soon as a request comes in, CAS looks into the service registry and it realizes, oh, you got to do strong two-factor, so let's do that. So that would simplify that configuration a little bit. In addition to doing this on a per application level, what we also want to do is we want to figure out if a particular user attribute requires us to do two-factor or MFA. Right? So when you authenticate, if I log in as Misa, I'm looked up in Active Directory if that's where my attributes are coming from. And an attribute there describes that this particular user, because I'm very important and apparently very dangerous, I need to be truly authenticated to really indicate that I am really who I say I am. So we want to do it per attributes and per users as well. Then to get things really, really complicated, previously we had just one way of specifying an authentication method. Right? It was just a request parameter. You told it what it was, and if CAS knew about it, great. If not, sorry, I don't know. Now we've got multiple ones, and there is a possibility that the three that we're going to have, they might collapse. What's the right word? Clash with each other, right? I might opt in, and at the same time, I'm part of an application that requires MFA, and I'm also a very dangerous person, and my attribute says I got to do MFA, and these all required levels could be very different. They may not have to be the same. So to get things complicated, as I said, and if I haven't confused you already, we need to come up with a way to rank these. We need to figure out what the required authentication method for me should be. Should I use what was told to me at the login URL? Should I look at my service registry? Should I look at my attribute? What is the level that I need, that CAS needs to complete, really? So we ought to be able to come up with a way to rank these. And then to make things a bit more comfortable, we're going to add support for dual security, so that there's a vendor that you can sort of take advantage of by default via this extension. But we still, again, as a design principle, we want to remain architecturally vendor agnostic. We don't want to tie the code base to any particular APIs that Duo forces us to do. We want to be able to abstract all that as much as we can, so that you could integrate your particular provider into this extension. And we're going to also focus on the Java CAS client, an official client by Apereo, to sort of enhance and allow the application to better communicate the authenticated method required, and to be able to consume it, validate it, and really pass it on to the application as best as it can. So we're going to focus on this one particular client to as a test bed, really, to validate all the stuff that we're working on at the server level. Again, we want to make sure that the existing applications work just fine. This is not going to be an intrusive, forcing down, you got to do this type of requirement. Applications that work already should continue to work already, as they did. Any questions so far? all makes sense or it's completely confusing? All right, silence apparently is good. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some details that we think might happen. So in the way that we're going to use or take advantage of the service registry to define this required authentication method per app is we're going to take advantage of the beloved JSON service registry, and it allows us to do this extra attributes bit with the required authentication method specified for test.app.edu. Now remember that the service ID can be a pattern, so you can really say any application that belongs to the app.edu domain is or should satisfy the strong two-factor authentication way of logging in. So that's how we're going to plan to do it at the service registry level. Again, as a user attribute, you might be logging in as Tom Bombadil, another beloved character in Lord of the Rings. And a user attribute that you specify by configuration. In this example, my user attribute or Tom's user attribute is authenticated auth_method, and it says strong two-factor. The name of the attribute is obviously configurable. It may be something else in your institution. So some initial design ideas on how to do this. Development is ongoing, right? Very much happening on GitHub. All discussions, issues, pretty much everything that I tried to explain and review for you, this is all public knowledge on issue tracking. I would very much encourage you to take part in discussions. If you have ideas on how things could be implemented better, please do log those, and we'll try to ignore them as best as we can.
Misa?
Yes.
Originally, it was developed with Evergreen.
Yes.
And so it is in production.
It is in production, Evergreen, yes.
The first level.
So yeah, if you have any additional thoughts about this, please do let us know. Okay. How am I doing on time?
Good.
All right, very good. So, any questions? I think it's time for discussions.
I'm still not really clear on what the difference is between the first level that Evergreen has implemented and Duo Security.
So, Evergreen, that's a good question. Evergreen implemented a version, well, the current version of this extension. What they did was, for the second factor, they had their own provider. And they had their own way of authenticating folks with a hardware device. And they had their own token, and they were using Radius, so they configured the second factor to behave that way. What we want to do with Duo is we want to be able to add an official support for a particular provider, a two-factor provider. Duo happens to be pretty common, it's pretty popular, and it's quite easy to do, actually. I mean, we've done projects with Duo before, so it just seemed like the best choice for a truer use case.
So Duo is not using Radius.
I actually don't know what Duo is using.
Oh.
So that's the beauty of this thing, that we don't have to care what they're doing. So Duo supports, and I think Bill has done demos on Duo where they call your phone, they can text you, and all the usual stuff. But I don't know, I haven't physically looked at the APIs to see what the interaction is. How are we going to tell Duo that we need to do X, Y, Z? But I've seen folks do it. I know the University of Chicago has done stuff with Chib with it, and it's quite easy to do apparently.
The reason for Duo is as part of the Income and Net Plus initiatives, good pricing options with it. We were looking at mostly using their mobile app, really push to your mobile app. But it also works in your phone's in airplane mode, and you can do a one-time password on your phone, will generate, and we'll accept that. And it does an SMS thing, like you said. So there's a lot of flexibility, you know, in case your phone, and you can actually do things like, do our administrators, the help desk will be able to print you out 10 one-time passwords in case your phone got smashed by your car and it'd take you 10 days to put in a phone. So you can ways to work around that, so when people have lost phones and broken phones and dead phones, we can still get doctors logged in if they have to.
There's also a community project, I think the University of Chicago may be leading, to work with Duo to augment their management console facilities to meet the needs of higher educational research, also on the Net Plus stuff. So. Folks seem to be pretty happy with their service, and their APIs are really easy to integrate with.
One final thing, and there's still time for questions. I'm not trying to barge it under their time, but the where's my crow? So I mentioned that I don't have a demo for you, and that's internet failing me completely, and possibly Portal somehow, or the build process. But the code base that I mentioned on GitHub is also deployed on Heroku, which is a cloud provider that allows you to deploy web application. So you can actually, if you go to casmfa.herokuapp.com, and it's public, this is documented on the project repo, you can effectively start using this way of second factor authentication with your application. Just point it to this particular URL and use this CAS server to log in and sort of evaluate how things would work with your given application. The demo is available should you need it to some extent.
What's the second factor that's integrated here?
It's all username, password. These are all hard-coded just for a demonstration. So you log in here. Let me try see if I can log in. So I think the first factor is admin or username equals password. So I'll log in with Misa. And I go here and sorry. That's because my credentials are. So my first credential should be CAS user, right? Username equals password, just for the demo. And it knows I'm Tom, right? For some reason. And then I'll log in with Melon, which was my password for the second factor. And then I go to sample.app.edu. Right? So these are hard-coded credentials in. Nice. What might happen, let me show you something else that I think is really cool. And this is the link, this is the project README, this is where the URL is for the Heroku thing.
So technically it's not a second factor, it's just a second password.
Yes, exactly. You got it. So let's see, if I try to go into this, if you somehow try to trick the CAS server, right? So remember, my first credential set are username equals password. My second credentials that I'm using for two-factor, just for the demo, are CAS user Melon. If I provide anything else, I'm going to fail. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to log in as Misa. What I will be authenticated as, the principal ID of the CAS server is going to be Misa. Then I go into the second screen, and it expects CAS user Melon to come in. But CAS user Melon is not going to come in. Misa Melon is going to come in. So let's see what happens. All right, I'm going to try Melon. It doesn't even let me log in. Yeah, good. So it really knows who you are, or it tries to do. You can't trick it. If you decided that you were one thing in the first factor, and then suddenly you decided that you're no longer the same person, you became a second one, it knows that there is a mismatch between identities. It tries to stop it. So again, point being, the demo is available with some hard-coded credentials. You can take them out. Yes, sir?
What did Evergreen use for the second factor?
They used Radius. That it talked to their identity keys. Or
have you guys played with Open Two-Factor?
The Chris Heiser.
Yeah.
I've seen demos of it. I haven't actually deployed and tested it, but it looks pretty cool. I've seen it on the Apereo wiki, and I've been meaning to take a look.
It would fit pretty well.
Yeah. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Anything else you'd like to talk about? Any ideas? Okay. Bill.
So what about this in CAS 4?
Oh, excellent question. So I mentioned the CAS talk. Who here attended CAS talk? Some folks did. I see some familiar faces. So CAS 4 comes with redesigned authentication APIs with the intention to start supporting, and I can't emphasize this enough, start supporting multi-factor authentication use cases. No support for a direct provider or vendor like Duo or anything else. You can start building one if you want to. And so the objective for the project is that as we move forward, we start developing use cases like this, opt-in, per app, per attribute, all this stuff, and we get some ideas on how to do this, but at least the thought is that the foundation is laid so that that work can be done. Hopefully, and Unicon has been doing this, much of the work that we are doing on this CAS MFA extension, we are trying to contribute back to the CAS code base. And some of the stuff has already happened. Again, there are some peculiarities in the way that this is done versus what the CAS project intends or has the code base organized, so we just need to work through those kinks. But for the most part, our intention is to contribute as much as we can. All good? All right. Thanks for listening.
Hey, John,
Yes, sir.
have you read that document on OpenDJ?
I'm looking at it now.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see Berkeley back there. I would have gone straight to the horse.
Yeah.
Fine, I think I don't have to